I think Dr. Carlo described it very well. The gilt did it. So we know the patient 0 from the investigation. Now we have to take some action. We have to make some improvements. Daniel talked about going back to the future. So how are we going to address the root cause of this problem? To pamper our princess, we have to get our princess through exposure to the pathogens on our farm. And we'll talk about how to do that here over the next 30 minutes before we go into another roundtable discussion and wrap up for the event. There are 5 messages that I think if you take nothing else away from my presentation, remember this slide. 5 critical messages when it comes to gilt management. Number 1, gilt acclimation is the foundation for good system health. And when I say system, I mean farrow to finish. If you do not have good gilt acclimation, you will not have good control of the endemic pathogens in your farm. The endemic pathogens are the ones that all the pigs get exposed to. Gilts are a necessary evil. We must manage them effectively. Management of gilts requires us to both acclimate them and develop them. We use those terms interchangeably sometimes, but we should not. Gilt development and gilt acclimation are 2 very different things. The gilt's life is very time specific, and you will hear me talk about taking control of your gilts as early as possible in their life. This is becoming more and more important as gilt ADG, gilt growth rates, increase. Why is it becoming more important? Because as the gilt grows faster, she reaches the breeding weight at a younger age. So if we are behind in gilt acclimation today, it's going to get worse tomorrow. It's going to get worse next year, and a decade from now, it's going to be a severe problem. Your maiden gilt reproductive efficiency should be the best in your herd. Your gilts that have never been bred before should have the best conception rates and farrow rates of any parities in your herd. If they do not, you likely have a disease problem in your breeder herd. We want the pathogen exposure to result in infection and recovery before breeding, if at all possible. Okay? If we breed the gilts at 210 days of age, we want them to be infected and recovered. Recovered means not shedding by the time we get to that age. So that sets the clock. That tells us when we have to start our acclimation program. And ultimately, if we want to measure how effective our acclimation program is, just measure your post-weaning health. If your post-weaning health is poor from the endemic pathogens, like in this case with poor respiratory health that is coming from the breeder herd, by definition, our acclimation practices are not very successful. Let's talk about the difference between gilt acclimation and gilt development. Gilt acclimation is the process in which we immunologically prepare the gilt for life in our breeder herd. Okay? We want to use a combination of vaccination, intentional exposure, and where appropriate, medication to get our gilts immunologically competent, to move them into a resistant category, meaning that they can see reasonable doses of a pathogen going forward in their life and not suffer disease consequences from that. It's very different from gilt development. Gilt development includes things like boar exposure, a heat no service program. It's pretty easy to divide the 2 simply by thinking that gilt acclimation focuses on preparing the gilt for the health experiences she will see throughout her life in the breeder herd. Gilt development is about preparing the gilt for reproductive success, preparing the gilt for highly efficient reproductive success. When we think about acclimation, I always go back to this triangle. This is a public health or a population health principle, but really it describes that for every pathogen, we as individuals live somewhere on the continuum between susceptible, infected, and resistant. Okay? We are talking about endemic pathogens. So the gilts may enter the herd susceptible to endemic pathogens on your farm. If we think about the gilts from our case, they are not coming to the farm with the PRRS. They are receiving the PRRS when they get to the farm. Susceptible means if they see the pathogen, they will move into the infected category. Now, infection is not necessarily a bad thing. How many people in here are infected with E. coli right now? All of us. All of us are infected with E. coli. Infection does not have to equal disease. And in fact, we want to use all the available vaccines and medications to minimize the disease consequences associated with this exposure. Our goal with these incoming gilts is to usher them as a group through the infection process for the endemic pathogens with minimal clinical signs, minimal duration of infection into the resistant category, meaning they are immunologically competent. They have a robust immune system capable of managing exposure to all of the pathogens in the breeder herd. And then we hope that through the passive transfer of colostrum, the gilts share that resistance to their susceptible piglets when they hit the farrowing house. This is not a complete list, and it's certainly not a perfect list for every breeder herd, but these are typically the endemic pathogens of swine that we think about when we think about gilt acclimation programs. And we certainly don't set up specific exposure processes for every bacteria or virus on this list. But I would think of it this way. If you have a problem in your nursery or your finishing system with any of these diseases, I would consider, are you thinking about gilt acclimation as it relates to these diseases? Because generally, this case study plays out similarly for every pathogen, meaning that when we have a problem in our growing pigs, the problem starts at the breeder herd, but it doesn't start with every parity at the breeder herd. It's a gilt problem, generally. So we need to come up with some sort of a program to vaccinate and/or assure immunity development for all the pathogens on this list. Now, how do we know that our gilt program, our gilt management program, is being efficacious at making us a good pig producer? Well, certainly, we can look at the outcomes. We want our gilts to become parity 3 sows. I don't know if Lance is still in here, but Lance could probably do some economics to help us understand that the investment in the gilt is a bad investment if we don't get her to a parity 3 sow. The purchase cost of the gilt, the feed the gilt needs, the diagnostic testing and isolation, the vaccinations, the semen for the breeding, all of those costs are racking up throughout the first and second parity. We only achieve revenue when we get the wean pigs from the gilt. So we need to get the gilt all the way out to parity 3. And to do so, we certainly need excellent SOPs, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. We need people doing the right things at the right time. We need good gilt development practices to make sure that we hit our mating targets at the right date. We need excellent gilt selection, and then we need to make sure we are bringing gilts into heat. We ideally want to breed every gilt with a heat, no service event. I don't have data to go through in this presentation, but I'm sure you've seen it before. The gilt total born becomes your whole breeder herd total born, okay? And if we miss H&S's, if we are breeding gilts without a documented heat no serve, we are giving up total born. And total born is a huge economic opportunity for every farm. I said we would talk through the labor, the SOP management for a 5,000 sow farm, we typically expect to have one full-time GDU employee. And that is in the United States, where we use very minimal amounts of labor. There would be approximately 16 total employees for this farm. 5,000 head breeder herd. Farrow to wean, there would be maybe 16 employees, one of which is a full-time gilt development employee. All right? We need that to be a high-level employee. We need that to be somebody we can trust. Generally, the gilt developer is an easy place to hide. The farrowing people don't go there. The breeding people may go there sometimes. The farm manager may not go there. I think it's really important to remember that on a breeder herd, most of the people that work there, they don't know a lot about growing pigs. And what is a gilt? A gilt is a growing pig. And that can be intimidating for a sow farm manager, for a breeder herd manager that knows everything about farrowing and everything about breeding, to have this whole section of the farm that they aren't very comfortable with. And so if we have someone who's not trained in the gilt developer, we can have some serious problems develop quickly and go unaddressed for a long time, simply because it's an area of the farm that not many people go to visit very often. Because a lot of people don't go visit there, we really need the person who works in the GDU or the gilt development unit to be very self-motivated. We need them to be accountable. We need them to not need somebody, that we don't want them to be somebody who needs to be micromanaged all the time. So thinking about the personality of your employees can be very helpful in selecting the best employee to take on this responsibility. We're also going to have a couple of assistants who go down there, particularly for boar exposure and the H&S process. We won't go into a lot of details on gilt development, but I would encourage you to check out the gilt manual that you have, the hard copy book that you have, because it gives you a lot of good details on appropriate gilt development practices. And then the manager. As I mentioned, the GDU is typically a separate building. It can be a place where maybe the manager is not terribly comfortable because maybe the manager was a farrowing lead and then became the farm manager, but really never was in charge of the GDU. So we need to encourage the manager to get down there multiple times a week to make sure that everything is going as expected. It's very important that we calculate our gilt needs and provide enough gilts, all right? Especially if you are thinking about making a change. Many producers bring in gilts at 20, 24, 26 weeks of age because they don't have space on site to raise the growing gilts. That can be an okay strategy, but if you're having a problem with gilt acclimation, you probably need to consider making an investment in your facility. You need to be able to bring the gilts in at a younger age. Dr. Daniel told us 2-3 months after the exposure to PRRS before they're going to clear the virus. Well, if I bring in a gilt at 26 weeks of age and she sees the PRRS at maybe 28 or 30 weeks of age, I want to breed her then. She's going to go through the PRRS infection during her gestation period. That is a recipe for disaster. We may have to acquire more space to be able to raise up our gilts on site, to start the acclimation process earlier. And if we do that, this gives you some estimates of how many gilts you need to buy. If you're buying select gilts today, you can assume you're going to breed 95%-ish of those gilts. So if your breed target is 95 for gilts, you buy 100, you will hit the target. You can't do that if you shift over to buying wean gilts. If you shift over to buying wean gilts, you need to buy extra gilts because those ISO weans, you don't know how many of them will qualify as this select gilt. But you need to prepare for the fact they will have umbilical hernias. They will have poor growth rates, things that you can't necessarily predict. So if you're going to go buy gilts as weaners, you need to increase the number of gilts you are buying from the current state today. In an ideal situation, our gilt acclimation program is pretty simple. We expose the gilts to the resident herd pathogens, and we'll talk about a couple of ways to do that. But we get the gilts exposed to that long list of pathogens that I put up on a previous slide. And we do that early enough in life that we have no cost of infection at the time of breeding. okay? We really want no clinical disease by about 160 days of age, because that's going to be when we are starting the bore exposure and the heat no serve or the HNS process. Even if we're not going to breed them to 200 or 220 days of age, there are going to be outliers. Lance talked to us a lot about variation. In this case, it is variation to the good. There are gilts that are 135 kilograms at 160 days of age. If we don't breed those gilts then, they're going to be 160, 180 kilograms when we finally do breed them. And that is typically a very bad experience. Those animals that are too heavy when they are bred, they don't typically perform very well, and they definitely don't stay in the herd until they are parity 3s. Ultimately, we can't have any shedding by the time of farrowing. And that's variable. A disease like PRRS, we can't have shedding while they're gestating because PRRS passes into the piglets in utero. A disease like mycoplasma is different. Mycoplasma does not pass in utero to the piglets. So mycoplasma, we can get away with pathogen clearance by 315 days. Why 315 days? I'm assuming an average breeding age of about 200 days, okay? But remember that breeding age is going to change with time. As gilt growth rates increases, we will breed gilts younger and younger. So if you think you have a small problem today with gilt acclimation, it's going to get bigger if you don't make a change to start that process earlier. I call this US-style gilt development, but really it is just what I would say is my preferred style of gilt development. For farms that we manage in the Carthage system, this is how we try to build the farm and structure it so that the gilts flow and we accomplish all of these goals by those critical ages we need to. So we typically bring in a commercial breeder herd, we bring in gilts every 4 weeks. Every 4 weeks. And we bring them in as wean gilts. And they go to live in an isolation facility. All right? The isolation facility is attached to the main breeder farm, but not part of it. So we bring in the gilts, we lock down the isolation facility, and they stay in there for 4, maybe 8 weeks. It depends on how big the isolation facility is. At 20 weeks of age, we'll do the final selection, and we vaccinate the select gilts at that point. Some of those vaccines need boosted, and we typically give the booster 21 days later. So we want to have all of our vaccines done by about 161 days of age, and we start the boar exposure essentially immediately after that. And you will find gilts and heat at that age. Absolutely, you will find gilts and heat at that age. So we've got to get that boar exposure started that early. We will move gilts into crates after they have their first HNS and they have the weight that we think allows them to be bred in their next heat event. So typically if they're within 15 kilograms of the target breeding weight, when we have an HNS, a heat no service, that's when we will move them into gestation crates and breed them at about 135 kilograms. I should highlight that 135 kilograms is really primarily a PIC recommendation. You may use different genetics. And if your genetic provider advises you to breed at a heavier weight, that's certainly understandable. You can make adjustments to your program if that's the case. Another important action date is the date that we administer a hormone like PG600. I would recommend 220 days of age. If no heat, we use PG600 to try and induce that heat. The vaccination program is a really important part of acclimation. It's got to be done very timely and very well. There's a very nice picture that walks through a great example vaccination program in your manual. I'll go through that kind of chronologically in the gilt's life. So bring in the gilts as weaners and give them their PCV2 and mycoplasma vaccinations at that time. We'll typically use 3-flex so we can accomplish our PRRS vaccination, our Circo and Myco vaccines right after we receive them at weaners. And then we'll do the oral vaccination with ileitis and erysipelas sometime in that nursery period. And that really takes care of kind of their growing pig vaccines. Once they move into the continuous flow GDU, that's when we will booster with MLV vaccine. And we will go to the killed vaccines that are the pre-breeding vaccines. So we'll booster the Circo and Myco again. will do their parvo, erysipelas, lepto vaccines, and typically in the US, we will use killed influenza vaccine as well. These vaccines are all given to the select gilts. So these are given to the gilts weaning and then the nursery period. Then we give these vaccines at that 20 weeks of age right after we have selected them. If you're going to intentionally expose for pathogens, whether it's mycoplasma or anything else, you want to be very specific about when you do that. For mycoplasma, we'll show the math here in a little bit, you need to do that as soon as possible. And I would say similarly to PRRS. Any pathogens you're going to do intentional exposure on, sooner is better because we want them to recover. No shedding by breeding if at all possible, and for sure, no shedding and farrowing. Some of you have visited us in Carthage, maybe even gone to this exact farm. We're not very creative, so we tend to build farms that all look exactly like this. The design works pretty good. So if you're a gilt, you get delivered down this road to this farm, and you back right up to this isolation nursery. On this farm, it is a 4-room isolation nursery, and you will spend the first 8 weeks of your life in there. So there are 2 batches of gilts, each that cover 4 weeks worth of the gilt breeding target that are being raised in this isolation unit simultaneously. The older gilts graduate to the GDU 8 weeks after they arrived, and this GDU is a continuous flow GDU where we move the gilts to feed. Okay? Marius has a very nice schematic of a continuous flow GDU in your Gilty Gilt book. You'll notice that the pins are different sizes. The pins are different sizes because the gilts are growing. So they start in small pins, but because the pins grow in size, we can move the exact same number of gilts from this pin to the next pin every 4 weeks. We move the gilts to feed until eventually they go into the gestation barn to be crated and to be bred and eventually into the farrowing house. Let's take a look at what that looks like. I mentioned that there are 4 rooms. This would be an example of one of those rooms. The nursery period really doesn't require any special facilities. We're not using any boars in here during this time. We don't have to do any unique gilt selection processes. So truly just build a nursery like you would for the commercial pigs that this breeder herd produces, and you will be just fine. When we move into the grower, it's hard to appreciate in this picture, but this is where we're starting to see the different size pens. And typically they'll move in and they'll start in the back of the room, closest to the hallway from that isolation nursery. And we'll typically have 3 groups. So we'll have 12 weeks worth of animals in the grower side of our GDU. We'll move them every 4 weeks until they move across that barn into the finisher. And we'll typically have 2 groups in the finisher at that point. So as we're talking about acclimation, let's do a quiz question here, all right? We can certainly overwhelm these gilts. I used the example of E. coli before, and we're all infected with E. coli today, but not diseased. But as these gilts are getting exposed to the pathogens of the sow farm, we kind of want to pamper them, right? They are our princesses. They are truly the future of our production system. So how can we tell if the gilt populations are being overwhelmed by that process? You saw the long list of pathogens: salmonella, rotavirus, influenza, mycoplasma, PRRS. That's a lot to see. How can we tell if the gilts are being overwhelmed by that acclimation process? And we're making them sick, not necessarily making them resistant. So let's pull up the QR code for the Slido, and we can see if we think it is increased morbidity, increased mortality, average daily gain, or some combination of them, or none of them. What do we think? How can we know if our gilt acclimation program is too intense, if we're not using the vaccinations and the medications appropriately? All right, excellent, excellent. You've been paying tremendous attention to Dr. Daniel and Marius and everybody else who has presented. So you are correct. All the above. They are sick. Don't overthink it. We don't want the gilts to get sick. Sick gilts don't do us any good, right? We only have so many gilts. And if the mortality level goes up, we're not going to be very good at selection because we're just going to be stuck with all the gilts that are still alive because we need them to hit our breeding targets. All right, let's go back into the PowerPoint, please. We want a controlled challenge, but it's really easy to see that the populations can be overwhelmed. So if they get sick, if we have mortality, average daily gain, we have to address that. And nowhere is this a bigger problem than with PRRS, okay? I get this question all the time. How should I manage immunity at my sow farm for my gilts for PRRS? Vaccine or live virus, serum exposure, live virus inoculation, whatever you want to call it. Relying on serum alone is very easy to overwhelm the gilt populations. This is actual field data from 1,000 gilts that were exposed to serum, wild-type PRRS virus, 1,000 gilts where they used modified live vaccine as their method to induce immunity. And then we looked at the mortality, and this is just the GDU mortality for the gilts, the growth rate of the gilts in pounds, the feed efficiency of the gilts, the selection rate. What percentage of the gilts were of the quality at 20 weeks that we said, okay, I actually want those to become a member of my breeding herd. What percentage of the gilts achieved their H&S at 28 weeks and at 35 weeks? How many of the gilts did we breed? Of the 1,000 gilts we brought, what percentage of them did we breed, right? And then how many of those gilts that we bred farrowed, and what was our total born? I don't need to go through every metric. Every single one is in favor of modified live vaccine. Look at the huge differences in our H&S rates. The huge differences in the ones that we bred. Out of 1,000 gilts, we trashed 250 of them in the LVI category. Look at the loss in total born. And that loss is going to carry throughout the entire herd as their parity 2s, parity 3s, parity 4s. You will never catch that total born up. What you give away in gilt total born, you're going to suffer from that throughout the entire experience of the sow farm. So don't overwhelm your gilts, and serum is certainly an opportunity to do that. If you have this situation where you don't have space to acclimate your gilts, if you're listening to me and you're saying, I understand that, I know that I need to start this acclimation earlier. I heard Daniel say 2 to 3 months at least for my PRRS, but I don't have the space. I think that absolutely the economics of your poor performance justify building GDU space. I know it is difficult to go to an accountant and say, I want to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in the GDU. And the accountant will always say the same thing. Well, how many more wean pigs are you going to produce? How many more sows will you have? None. I will have no more sows. I want to make a big investment in the facility, but I'm not going to farrow any more animals. That's a tough conversation to have. You have to show them the economics post-weaning. There are different exposure methods, and I'm happy to go into more details on this if we want when we get in the roundtable discussion. But certainly the most common remains natural contact. If you do natural contact, make sure you are selecting young parity animals to be your exposure animals. Natural contact means that in the GDU, we take some cull animals, some non-breeding gilts, some parity ones that have had an abortion, animals that are destined to cull, but we take them to the GDU. The biggest mistake I see made is people bring parity 6, parity 7 sows to the GDU. They are culls. But think about the susceptible, infected, and resistant triangle. What are the odds that parity 6 is still shedding mycoplasma or PRRS or any of the important pathogens? Not very good. So natural contact can work. Make sure you pick the right animals. And certainly, we talked a little bit about fogging, intratracheal exposure for mycoplasma. There are more direct ways that we can do exposure if and when we feel that's necessary. Some of you may be saying, well, I don't need to worry about acclimation like for mycoplasma because the gilts that I buy, they come from a mycoplasma positive source. That's fair. The reality is we don't understand mycoplasma cross protection in terms of does exposure to this mycoplasma strain result in immunity that's protective against all the other mycoplasma strains? We don't know that. We know that there is genetic diversity in mycoplasma. You can make a mycoplasma dendrogram. Our friends at Swine Vet Center have done that. But we can't predict cross-protection. And I can tell you that throughout my career, I have worked with producers that would buy gilts that were mycopositive. We bring them into a mycopositive breeder herd, and they start to cough. So I think that suggests that the cross-protection is not always perfect. Even if you're buying mycoplasma-positive gilts, you still need to think about acclimation for mycoplasma. Why is it so important to get the exposure done for mycoplasma? Because the duration of infection is so long. Daniel mentioned 2 to 3 months for PRRS, and you're probably thinking, oh, that is a long time. Well, mycoplasma, we often are concerned about shedding for up to 256 days after infection. That's 8 months. If you do the math, if we have wean gilts that come in, and maybe we get them infected by 8 weeks of age, well, add 254 days to that, you get 310 days in which those animals stop shedding. Well, that's just before they farrow their first litter. So if you're not starting this process in the nursery, if you're bringing animals in way up here at 25 weeks, even if you get the infected the day they come in, they farrow their first litter, still at 325 days, it's over 100 days later that they're going to stop shedding. We're almost into the second parity at that point. That's why gilt acclimation is so important for mycoplasma. You may be saying, well, I have mycoplasma problem or I have PRRS problem, but I have both. So even if I fix one, I'm still going to have a big problem. Having multiple diseases present is not 1 + 1 = 2. It is often 1 + 1 = 4 in terms of the impact. PRRS and mycoplasma together are very synergistic. They cause respiratory disease at a much higher level than either one individually. So think about the 1 + 1 = 4 math in another way. If we can remove the disease pressure from either mycoplasma or PRRS, we may have a huge reduction on the overall disease. This simply shows a difference in baseline for mortality with just mycoplasma, just PRRS, or in combination. And you can see it's a multiplicative effect. It's not linear. We actually have a much greater impact. And if you're looking to justify the economics of the gilt development unit, it's all right here, right? If we can reduce the combination disease to just one or the other, we're talking $5 to $10 per pig impact. That is enough of an economic incentive to go make that investment in your gilt acclimation program. So let's talk about how to measure it. It's very important to system profitability. You think about all of these metrics, right? Let's talk about your gilt reproductive performance. Should be the best in the herd. So the conception rate and the total born, if your gilts are not leading the way in terms of the parities for their conception rate and total born, you probably have a health problem and you probably need to work on your acclimation program. If you're not retaining your gilts past parity 1, past parity 2, you probably have a health problem that we need to work on with acclimation. And I mentioned the ultimate way to measure is your wean to market performance. Are the endemic pathogens under control in your wean to market system? Here are some benchmarks that you can use to help say, am I getting what I need from my gilts? Am I competitive in today's landscape with gilt performance? Farrowing rate should be the highest in the herd. If you've got a healthy herd, 92% farrow rate on your gilts, it's very achievable, very achievable. Your total board should be at least 15, if not 15.5, okay? Born alive should be at 14. You should be weaning over 12 per litter from those gilts. We should be able to hit a 75% number of the gilts that we breed all the way to farrowing a third parity. That is a realistic target. 75% of the gilts we breed should become a parity 3 with no second litter dip. Second litter dip means that we lose in total born on the second litter. And ultimately, we want to get at least 60 weaned piglets out of every gilt that we enter into the herd. Some PRRS-specific measurements that you can use, certainly processing fluids of your gilt-specific litters are a wonderful way to understand, are we winning the battle against PRRS? Are we effective at getting through the infection before we breed those gilts? We can certainly measure post-weaning oral fluids as well. The gilt ferrule rate, as I mentioned, and the gilt mummy rate. Gilt mummy rate is a good one to look at if you think you may have a PRRS problem. So I went through these before, but I think they're so important I want to hit them again before we wrap up. Gilt acclimation is the foundation for your entire production systems health program. If we don't have that solid foundation, everything else we do is just Band-Aids. Band-Aids are important, but it's not a long-term strategy. Gilt acclimation and development really relies on specific schedules. They are different things, and they can't happen at the same time. The gilt can't be getting ready for all the health challenges and to be reproductively successful at the same time. We need to set a schedule and make sure we hit those target ages. Your maiden gilt reproductive efficiency should be the best of all parities in your herd, and we want that pathogen exposure to result in the infection and recovery, meaning no shedding, prior to breeding. Post-weaning endemic pathogen control is ultimately how we can measure if our gilt acclimation program is working or not. With that, I would like to invite all the speakers back up on the stage so we can discuss the roundtable this afternoon.